Hey YouTube people, and welcome to the Seabutters Tech channel. Today we're going to be looking at the 7950 X3D. Now we all know that it's the reigning champion now in terms of a gaming processor, but I wanted to look at it from the perspective of virtual reality. That's not something that's commonly covered. Now, there's a reason for that, and some of the reason for that is it's notoriously very difficult to do benchmarking in the VR environments. There's just so many variables. So I'm going to talk through my test setup, what I did, and how I compared the 7950X with the 7950X3D. And we're going to see if it's worth it. So the test system, I used an Asus X670E ProArt AM5 motherboard. We're using 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM, G-Skill, 6000 megahertz using the Expo 1 settings. We'll be using an RTX 4090. It's the Founders Edition. And we're going to be using the CPUs AMD 7950X and the AMD 7950X3D. So all of these tests will be run under Windows 11. However, the one difference in the test setup is after installing the 7950X3D, there's a chipset driver along with the Xbox Game Bar, which needs an update, which allows it to know which core complex it should be using on that AMD CPU. For gaming, it should try to use the high 3D V cache core rather than the other core complex, which is more for frequency and is a traditional Zen 4 core. Now, the test hardware we're going to be using in terms of the VR is we're going to be using the Valve Index for Steam VR. It's Valve Index, kind of the gold standard for PC VR gaming. So that's why we're using it here. We're going to be using it at the 144 hertz setting. That's going to require the lowest frame times in order to keep the FPS up. So I wanted to make sure that we were trying to tax the CPU as much as possible. So that's why we're doing that there. We'll be using 100% scaling with 150% in-app scaling, which is kind of the default for this. That results in an effective render resolution of 2468 by 2744 per eye. So that being the rendering resolution, still pretty high, but we're going to see if we can run any CPU limited areas of VR and see how that affects our gameplay. So without further ado, let's get into some of the benchmarks. So first of all, Beat Saber. We're going to look at the CPU frame times. Now the frame time is the time that it takes for the frame to be displayed. There's a CPU frame time and a GPU frame time. We're going to be looking specifically at the CPU because we're comparing the CPUs. So in this particular benchmark, this is basically a 3-minute run of the exact same song, exact same settings. And what you can see is we're not seeing too much of a difference for the most part. Very consistent frame times across both. The 7950X definitely spiked harder, and also it's a little bit less consistent. In fact, if we compared these the averages of these frame times, the 7950X3D comes out just marginally ahead, but not anything that you would ever notice at all. So no real benefit that I can see in Beat Saber. So let's look at the next one. This is kind of just an Unreal Engine demo application. And in the same scene, same settings, you can see that there's actually quite a bit of difference going on here. So what we're seeing in the blue is the old 7950X, which has less cache, and it does seem to be a little bit more consistent, but at times the 7950X3D is actually, well, and when I say consistent, I mean its behavior seems consistent, but it's much tighter frames on the 7950X3D. And that kind of bodes with what I'm talking about, where obviously the GPU is the same. So only in the case where your CPU is your bottleneck is this going to make a difference for you. But what we find is there are lots of cases where having this extra cache does let your CPU perform quite a bit better. So let's keep moving on. Here's budget cuts. Looking at the CPU frame times here, Again, the orange is the X3D version, the blue is the old version, and you can kind of see the same behaviors happening during certain parts of the game. It will the frame times will become lower, and then at other times in this particular benchmark, what was happening is like it was shooting a portal, and when the portals were open, you kind of see that happen. But yeah, you can see that the 7950 X3D does drop into quicker frame times more, which is a good thing, and is slightly more consistent. You can see the blues are a little higher, a little lower on the 7950X, so a little bit tighter behavior on the 7950 X3D, a little bit more consistent behavior. Again, this is not doing a whole lot for our frame rates or even the experience in this particular test, but it is a measurable difference. So let's look at the ones that I found that were actually very effective. There are certain scenarios where the 3D V cache can be very effective, and so let's look at this one. This is VRChat, basically a Unity engine game. If you look at the frame times, and this is fairly physics heavy world, exact same world, you can see that basically these sections here is same exact viewpoint in that world upon load in, but you can see that the 7950 X3D has a lower frame time, averaging about 10 here, where this is up in the 12 to 13 to 15. And then at the point where it is at a less intensive area of the game, it has very consistent frame times down here, but you're seeing that as well as the 7950X. But definitely you're seeing lower frame times, lesser spikes, more consistent behavior. And so I kind of went after looking at this and saying, okay, now like Unity is where, and I've heard this, the 3D V cache is super effective for Unity games. And whether that's poor optimization on Unity's part or not, throwing 3D V cache at the problem does seem to fix the issue. So let's look at this one. This was the most drastic improvement by using the X3D cache. So anyone who plays VRChat, just know that there are some pretty heavy gains to be had from the 3D V cache. So for example, you can see here the old one without 3D V cache has much higher frame times, where the frame times on the 3D V cache processor 7950 X3D super tight, super low right here. And I just want to show you this. And you may be like, this is probably an error in benching. No, take a look. So let's go ahead and look at, oops. I'm going to show you a few things. So if we actually look at the GPU frame times, you can see this test was super consistent. So there's the GPU. You can see like this was done exactly the same. But the difference here is the CPU frame times are just incredibly lower on the X3D chip. So let me get rid of the GPU frame times. I'm just showing you that to see that these tests were very consistent and at the same settings. Let's look at the frame rate. So here's the frame rate on the 7950X. You can see it was kind of, around 110, 115 on average. And so this is the blue and the gray are, that's the same test. When we add in the frame times for the 7950 X3D, this yellow and this orange, you can see the lower frame times on that orange bar translate into much higher frames per second. So again, this is both on a 4090, but you're able to get consistent 144, well, not quite pegged at 144, but pretty close to it. So yeah, it's this in Unity, there's definitely some major improvements that 3D Vcache can give you, up to the point of making it, 100 frame per second experience versus 144 frame experience. So that's a pretty big uplift. So, what does this mean? Well, I'm not sure. It's kind of along the same lines of what we're seeing on the gaming benchmarks for everything else. In many games, you are literally not going to see a difference between the 7950X and the 7950X 3D, but there are certain situations where this 3D Vcache does kick in and provides a substantial benefit. So I would say if you have a 7950X, don't go out and buy a 7950X 3D unless you play a lot of Unity VR games. Maybe you're big into VRChat or whatever, then it might be worth it. But what I would say is if you're looking to between one that has 3D Vcache and one that does not, I would definitely consider for a new purchase the 3D Vcache, even if you wait for the 7800X 3D or maybe that 7900X 3D. But if you play games, I definitely think you ought to shoot for that X3D Vcache. So anyways, this was my quick look at VR for the 7950 X3D. Hope you enjoyed it. Like if you did, and subscribe if you want more great content. See you soon.